This is the endorsement interview for House District, and suddenly I'm forgetting which House District. Is it
29.
29? Thank you, Representative. Representative Susan McLean represents this district, and Representative will allow you to give us a 2-minute introduction and tell us about yourself, your district, and why you're running for re-election.
Well, thank you very much for inviting us today, and I am happy to let you know that I feel that at this time, District 29 has as many problems as the rest of the state, dealing with COVID and dealing with the wildfire responses, and also just dealing with the issues that we have right now for our economy and for our different sizes of businesses and also for our schools. And the areas that I have been involved with since I've been at the state legislature has primarily been around the areas of education, land use and agriculture, and transportation. And I'm the co-chair of the Joint Transportation Committee at this time, also the co-chair of the Education Budget Committee, and I'm the co-chair of the Bi-State Bridge Committee. Still on ag and natural resources or land use, because I choose that committee as another important one to House District 29, and I'm the vice chair of that committee. So with those leadership roles, I think at this time when there is so much need, and also for a person who understands and knows the district, I feel like it's important for me to continue this job at least for another 2 years. And I am working diligently on trying to make sure that I provide a voice for a wide variety of issues and a wide variety of citizens who are part of this district. I'm a 5th generation Oregonian, and I've worked hard to make sure that whatever I got involved in, I did 150%, and that I work hard on trying to listen and make sure that what folks have to say gets to Salem. So thank you very much.
Great. Can you remind us how much of your district was affected by wildfires?
We had 2 fires that were out by Hag Lake, Cherry Grove, and they're actually, outside of the district line, but the representative who lives on the coast represents the Gaston and some portions right outside of Forest Grove. And so I do get a lot of folks that call me from that area because I'm a little bit closer to them and have a little bit more understanding of what they're facing right there. And so I would say that as the crow flies, it's probably about 2 miles away from my personal house where the fire actually was.
Complete subject shift. What bill from the last couple of sessions that you either sponsored or co-sponsored is the one you're most proud of?
Well, I guess I'd have to say in 2019, it had to be the Student Success Act, because that was one that I spent a lot of time with because of my responsibilities on the Budget Committee. And we were working hard with Barbara Smith Warner, who was actually one of the chairs of the Student Success Act, to make sure that we worked diligently on making sure there wasn't redundancies of programs and that there was emphasis and prioritizing of programs for diversity and also for social and mental health issues for school students. And so I would say, I've always said this, that it's not usually a bill, it's usually a suite of bills and or an area that I'm usually the most proud of. So I would have to say education for 19. In 2020, I passed a number of bills. I had what we call a ditch bill in 2019 that I worked really hard in a very bipartisan way on helping farmers and folks in our area as well as statewide be able to clean their ditches and be able to do that in a safe and environmentally sound way. And that bill has taken up at least 3 years of my life, if not 4. And so I'm proud of the fact that we actually just got it through our rule-making process. It was not vetoed by the governor, which she had chosen to think about. And it's been supported by both Republicans and Democrats, and it's going to help a wide variety of folks not have flooding on their property and be able to farm and ranch in areas that have what we call water channels that need to be cleaned on a regular basis, but not every year.
You wouldn't think so, but the ditch bill was surprisingly controversial.
It was. And it's one of those things where I think the environmentalists were concerned that standards would possibly be lower if you allowed someone to clean a channel, but they were man-made channels that were dug, in the 1800s and have been farmed. So they are not pristine, undisturbed wetlands. And that's what we've been spending our time trying to really make sure everybody is comfortable with. And we did most of that in rulemaking. We have one more little tweak to make, and we're hoping to have that done before the session.
Here's a chance to sort of segue from that. How would you grade the governor, A to F, on her performance in the last couple of years?
Well, that's using the term or the phrase "couple years" is really a very, there's a lot to say there. I
sort of regret it already. I've kind of given you a lot of wiggle room that I probably shouldn't. Let's say since the year 2016.
Since 2016. Okay, well then I'm going to give her a B+.
Why?
Well, quite frankly, I think she has a lot of energy, and I think that she works really hard to try to gather a lot of information from a wide variety of sources. And I do believe that she listens, and I do believe that she wants to work in a bipartisan way. And that's hard to do in the process that we have sometimes, but I do believe that she's made every effort to make that happen.
Okay. On the Student Success Act, some of the lawmakers who voted yes on that act and its concurrent cuts to PERS received a challenge from the left, sort of as a bit of a punishment for voting against the pensions. You didn't, as far as I know.
What do you mean by that?
Did you have someone run against you in the primary who's to your left?
Oh, no.
Why do you think that is? Is that because your district is a more conservative district, or because you're just that beloved?
No, I don't think anybody's that beloved. But I will say that that was one of the hardest votes I ever had to make, because I understood that the teachers and the educators were going to see it as non-support. And so I had to hit it straight on and say, look, I have looked at absolutely everything we can do to get that Student Success Act. And one of them is that we have to show some reform in PERS. And I've said that from the get-go. I said that from the moment I walked off the floor and made that vote. And no, the Hillsborough School District HEA and Forest Grove HEA, they were given choices by the OEA. If they wanted to support an individual, they could, but it was totally up to the locals. And they chose not to support any of us who voted in favor of that change in PERS. And so I also feel, though, they understand that I work across the aisle and I have bipartisan support from others in their own, so both the left and the right know that I have an open mind and an open door, and I work with everybody.
Did that lack of teacher support harm your campaign in any way?
It's not nice, or it's not helpful when some of the folks that have supported you for 6 years all of a sudden are staying silent. But I would say that I have had a strong showing, even though this has been a crazy election year. And I have to say, since March 12th, I've worked on legislative things at least 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. And I have a staff member that we've both worked on unemployment and safety issues with COVID and e-distance learning, and it goes on and on, wildfire response. But it's one of those things where I think that I've held my own, and I've demonstrated that I am willing to look at both sides of an issue, and that I really try very diligently to research it out. And the court stood behind us. And if the courts hadn't stood behind us, I think it might have hurt more, but at this point, no.
Okay. I love this next question. Is there a mistake you've made in office that you most regret?
A mistake I've made. Okay. Well, I think sometimes you can get absolutely too invested in an issue, because I research a lot, I read a lot. I don't go into anything without making sure that I can see both sides of a debate or an issue. And so sometimes though you can get too invested because you put so much gosh darn time into it. And I would have to say that the one that I have done that to and with over the last 6 years has probably been on trying to get a statewide framework for TNCs, or some of the work that I've done on autonomous vehicles and the pre-work for that. I spent a lot of time in 2 years in an ODOT committee with a very large group of about 35 people. And I think that there were a couple of times where I was so invested in it that I quit listening for a while. And then I had to get back to listening both to jurisdictions and to the industry in a new way, trying to put aside everything I've heard, everything I've learned, and try to kind of start that conversation over again.
Is it a different conversation post-COVID?
Oh, yes.
How so?
I mean, you look at transit and you look at any kind of transportation. I'm spending a lot of time doing that right now, just even in the budget area, because we've been working on the bi-state bridge and working with the Washington State Legislature. We've been looking at, how Portland does things versus how other different sizes of communities do things in the state. And I think that it's different both on safety levels, the capacity for transit, the capacity for things like TNCs or autonomous vehicles. I think it's taken a turn. I think the industry is really rethinking what their product is. And so I think it's a whole new discussion.
Does the pandemic make self-driving cars more likely, less likely? It seems like it'd be more likely.
Well, yes and no. I mean, you've got to think about the fact that the COVID issue, when we went down 90% in our driving habits, and there were a couple of months where there was hardly anybody on the road. There's always been the feeling that autonomous vehicles might add vehicles to the road versus take vehicles off the road. And so there are issues there about capacity, congestion, and safety that are just going to be looked at again. That's all there is to it.
Okay. I had a great joke about the president in a self-driving car and how he wouldn't have gotten anybody sick, but I realized that that's probably not that funny. And Mark Zussman has a question.
Yeah.
Thanks, Taryn. Susan, I wanted to give you a chance to respond to our 2019 legislative report card, which, as you know, is compiled by us polling lobbyists, legislative staffers, journalists, and even some elected officials who are outside the metropolitan area. In the 2019 report card, you were given a rating of bad, 5.92 overall rating. I'm wondering if you want to speak to that at all.
At my peril, is that what you're offering me? I would say that, first of all, that your report card is a very unusual device that tests, I think, grading in a very interesting way. And the standards that you use are wide open, and it's kind of like just sort of like an open range. And I'm not always sure what your ratings mean, but I always take them seriously, because I always look at them to find out what I haven't thought about myself, or what I have not considered as possibly as important to others about either my performance or my way of doing things, or my leadership style. I mainly have had, after your report card has come out, every time it ever has, I've had more calls thanking me for my performance and for my input than I do any other time of the year. And I think that's always interesting, because I always read it. I have a lot of peers that never read it, but I always read it, and it's your report card, it's your open range style, and I really don't have anything to say about it. You enjoy doing it. And so I always read it, and I try to gain something from it. But, I also read it with a grain of salt.
Mark, did you have a follow-up on that?
I don't.
Okay. Who's your biggest donor in this cycle?
My biggest donor in the site right now, I have to be honest, I have worked really hard on a shoestring for this campaign. And I have a couple of friends that have given me $1,000. I think AFT gave me $2,000. AFT, and that was really nice too, because when the OEA and HEA didn't give, anybody who had voted for it, it was really gratifying to get theirs. I also had, I think, a couple of transportation type folks, people who would care about the work I was doing in joint transportation, that gave me a couple thousand, but it ranges in there a couple thousand to 1,000. I really don't have any real super big donations right now.
Okay.
Not like the other years.
Is that in part because your donors in the Democratic Party aren't too concerned about your opponent?
Of course.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, that's part of it. And, I'm trying to work for candidates that, quite frankly, have a swing race like I did in 14. 14 and 16 were, pretty difficult races for me. This last one was not as much.
Yeah, I remember in 14 in particularly, it was a tight race. Who was your opponent in 14?
14 was the fellow that was a dancer and a district attorney from Washington County. And you're going to make me not remember his name at this point.
Yeah, it's not a quiz. Sorry, I'm just trying to remember it myself. I was there.
Yeah.
What
is his name?
I think we're getting close to the end here. I want to jump back into something you were talking about a minute ago because it interests me. The bridge committee. So yeah, you're working on the Bi-State Bridge, which I guess is the rebranding of the Columbia River crossing at this point.
Correct.
Where is that? Like, as in, let me phrase this question a little more precisely. What year could we expect to actually see a Bi-State Bridge under construction?
Well, you've seen these big mega projects, and you know that the last time they went through this, it was like a 12-year process, and no one wants to repeat that. And the folks from Washington side, I've gotten to know Senator Cleveland quite well, and a few other folks, Representative Fye and others, and we are very interested in doing it in what we consider to be a reasonable time frame for a project of that size, with as many responsible reports and updates that have to be done. We've set up the committee. We have hired a director of the office. We have met for about a year, and I would say that you will see some kind of a project idea by 2023-24, and then you've got the actual construction.
How many years between the project idea and the actual construction?
Usually those bridges take at least 2 to 3 years, depending on specifically what kind of a design they have and what some of the challenges are, whether, it's a lift or whether it is a bridge that does not lift. And so it makes a difference on the technical and the engineer complexities. But the fellow that we've hired both and works now for both ODOT and WSDOT comes from the Midwest and has worked on bridges that have been to state and to country. He's worked on bridges that basically were between the United States and Canada, and then also between a couple of East Coast states. And his name is Greg Johnson, and he's miraculous, wonderful, down to earth. If you haven't met him, you should. And really, I think he has a very good time frame and an understanding of this type of size of a bridge. And he watched the last time through, because as he pointed out, this wasn't just an Oregon-Washington bridge. This was a West Coast freight corridor bridge. And it also makes a difference to all of us across the nation, because it affects our routes and our traffic as well.
Has he said to you what he thought went wrong with the last process?
We really have tried to analyze that. And one of the things that we're trying to do is make sure that they don't let the legislators off the hook by just, having us open the process and then come back and hand over a check, because that didn't work real well last time. And so they have worked really diligently on trying to make sure that they recognize all the partners and all the folks that need to make decision points and put that decision in the bank, as Greg is fond of saying, to make sure we check in along the way to make sure everyone is still on the same page. And so really and truly, last time there were 2 offices. Now this time we have 1 office. We have 1 office. We have a committee that is made up of both Washington and Oregon legislators that have committed to keeping those meetings going and the communication going, so that we again are able to stop at important points and make a decision, commit to it, put that in the bank, and get on to the next level of decisions.
Last question on this topic, I think, because I just find this interesting. Does the city of Portland has stopped participating in any Rose Quarter meetings or emails or discussions? Does that affect how a bi-state bridge conversation happens? And do you expect the city of Portland to take part in those conversations?
Yes, yes, and yes. You do not have basically a mega project like this that is not connected to the rest of the system. And the Rose Quarter and the I-5 corridor are part of that same system. That system includes 205. It includes, basically the circle around Portland. I think for whatever reason, whether it was a change in the chair of the Transportation Commission, whether it was because of the Black Lives Matters movement and some of the history with Albina, whether it was folks that were on the advisory committee for the Transportation Commission, that just when there was a transfer of leadership, that there was where they said, hey, let's just take a break. Let's just back off. Let's make sure we are all, again, really up for this endeavor and this combined partner conversation. I make the circle every 2 to 3 weeks, and that includes Portland, Albina, Metro, ODOT, and everyone else, the Transportation Commission, to make sure that we have got a good start. And the state has actually taken on a very large new beginning with the mobility office that we have Brendan Finn in. And so we are working diligently to make sure that they understand that we're doing systems analysis, and we are not just doing it project by project, which I think has been an old highway, freeway, ODOT, WashDOT type of I guess I would say procedure. But we are really working through, especially with Greg Johnson and with Brendan Finn and with the governor's office, to make sure that we're talking about mobility and congestion with a systems analysis. And so, yes, they will be involved. Yes, I think they will come back to the table. Do I think the conversations will be easy? No. Do I believe that the enhancement area, the 5 miles from the bridge down to the Rose Quarter, are important to the overall projects and the overall system? Absolutely. Is there a lot of work to do? Yes. The Rose Quarter has only about 15% of the design work done, and we're there to get the local communities as well as the statewide and West Coast interests very comfortable with the kind of project that is along that corridor.
Great.
Can I ask a question about that? As far as I understand, there's been a complete breakdown in the effort to engage the community on the Rose Quarter project. They had a committee set up, but they disbanded that committee. Do you have any concerns about how ODOT has addressed community concerns, particularly on the Rose Quarter project?
At this point, I have not seen any malfeasance in any way as far as, trying to engage a real authentic conversation. What I would say is that, as you know, anytime you've got 2 or 3 advisory committees and you've got different groups that are involved, that you have to stop and take stock of how it's going. And I think that they decided to actually start with a new committee. They didn't disband anything until folks said, hey, we need a break. We may need a reset. So let's really look at this, shall we, again? And I think that Brendan Finn, the governor's office, the mobility office, ODOT, the new director, Chris Strickland, have all been very proactive about listening and trying to make sure that the folks that are on that committee really do represent the Albina community as well as the larger Portland community in a way that they think they have all the voices and all the different opinions at the table, that they will need to have a completed conversation.
So, Democrats in the legislature say that climate change is one of their priorities. How do you think that the Department of Transportation should be prioritizing addressing climate change?
Well, I made a commitment when the speaker put me as co-chair of the joint committee that I felt that it was unfortunate that the climate committee actually came and reported out to the transportation committee that I was on at the end of the process versus having conversation along the process. So I personally told the director when he was hired that I felt it was really important for the transportation specialists at the state level to get involved with those climate conversations in a more proactive way that was going to allow for the best possible system for transportation statewide, but would also really take the filter of climate seriously and making sure that we were doing our very best to do our part as far as dealing with carbon and other elements of the climate story. So I personally feel that having a new director come on at that time, having a mobility office with Brendan Finn in it, having the governor's office make a commitment to the climate conversation, that we have all the things in place to do a better job that's actually going to get finished this time. Now, it's going to be hard because we've had COVID, and we've also had a situation with the wildfires that has caused us to have extra layers of complexity. But I think the timing is really, really good and really important and necessary for us to get that work done.
How do you see us addressing reducing, if you're committed to reducing, emissions, how do you reduce emissions while building a wider bridge and a wider I-5 in the Rose Quarter?
Well, first of all, you're assuming it's a wider I-5 and you're assuming it's a wider Rose Quarter area along there because—
It is wider Rose Quarter. I mean—
Well, I'm happy to talk about this with you, but I think that this is pretty important stuff. And so I'd really like to have a map or two or be ready for a little more thorough conversation, because there is a difference between widening a road and using on and off ramp, abilities, technology as well, to make sure you've got a flow of the cars that you've got there. You don't want them stopped and stalled, and you also do not want them to be putting out some kind of carbon as they are stopped and stalled. And so we've got to make sure that the roads that are there actually function well. So let's talk about threading on and off of freeways with a few more maps and letting me have an opportunity to bring something I'd love to share with you as that project goes forward.
So are you saying the bridge will not have more lanes?
It's not how many lanes, it's how the lanes are used. Right now, we're having a transit conversation talking about rapid bus and talking about lanes that would actually be dedicated to a rapid bus. So it's how you use the lanes, and it's what the lanes are laid out for.
Sure, but are you committing to not expanding the number of lanes for cars across the bridge? Is that what you're saying?
First of all, I'm not an architect and I'm not a designer, and so I'm committing not to be part of the design team. I'm there to make sure that the goals that we have, which is to help the climate, is actually being addressed by whatever the design team comes up with. So I'm committed to better climate policy.
But you're saying you don't need to commit to not increasing the number of car lanes, and that can still meet the state and the Democrats' priority for climate change. Am I understanding that correctly?
Well, I think that's your statement and your words, and I wouldn't say it that way.
I'm asking to understand what your position is.
My
position
position
you're not clarifying.
I think I am. And I would like to say that what my clarification was is that my goal or the output of whatever that project is a better environment.
What do you mean by environment?
An environment deals with air pollution, it deals with water quality, It deals with making sure that we're utilizing all of our resources that we consider to be important, like wetlands, and those types of things are protected and are used well, and are used in a way that it's going to cause our future generations and my grandkids and their children to be able to have clean air and clean water,
Okay.
and be able to have a variety of transportation modes.
Okay, but for you, that does not necessarily include not expanding the number of lanes for cars. Is that
I personally think that's a premature request that you're asking me to answer.
Thank you. I appreciate that clarification.
Mark, anything else? Rachel, you good? Cool. In that case, our last question is the fun question. And the fun question, it's always fun for me.
Okay.
The question this time around is, what's the most awkward moment, Representative, that you've had this year on a Zoom call?
Oh my, I've had so many. It's hard to pick just one. Okay, this is it. Talking about the Bi-State Bridge. I got up at 6 a.m. on the day that we were having a really important Bi-State Bridge Committee, and I was chairing that particular committee. And so it goes back and forth, Oregon, Washington, Oregon, Washington. And I got on half an hour early, and I had all my notes ready to go. And I was ready to start with, just a very large, welcome. And I got on and had about a 9-minute introduction, got all my work done, and then immediately was kicked off my internet because I had squirrels out there basically chewing my cables. And so it took 45 minutes for me to get back on. I got back on the phone and was able to hear them, but they didn't know my phone number, so they had muted me. They thought I was, public wanting to testify later. And then I managed finally to get back onto the computer after pulling my, every cord around, and got back on. And Mr. Beyer had been, Senator Beyer had been taking over while I was gone. He saw my face come onto the computer and he says, "Here's the gavel, take this on." I went, "Okay, here we go." But that was horrible. I just cringed for a week.
I've yet to hear a bad answer to this. I'm so happy with this question.
It's a really good question. Good on you, Erin. Thank you, Representative McLean.
You bet. Have a good morning.
You too. Really appreciate it.
Bye-bye now.